Dear college students, my name is Chris Vanderkay, and I'm one of the instructional assistants on the East Campus of Valencia for the Writing and Communication Center. And this video today is going to actually be talking about speech outlines. Now, one of the things I want to tell you before we even get into what is included in the outline is where you can find templates for these. We have a couple of different versions of it, but there's going to be a link in this video that will take you to a Google Drive that has handouts and resources for all different kinds of parts of papers, all the way from research, pre-writing, grammar, all the way to finalization and doing drafts of the paper. What we're going to be doing is going into the pre-writing section. So if you follow this link, when you come to here, you go into pre-writing, and then there will be, you see here, it says informative speech outline, and then let's see, the other one, persuasive speech outline. So those are the two we're going to be looking at today, but you can always go and download copies of these, and then you can use these as a frame of reference for what information you want to use and what format to put it in. So as I said, we're going to be looking at informative and persuasive speech outlines today. There are other kinds of speeches, narrative speeches, but we're just going to use these two because they show the general shape of what it is you want for an outline. So really what you're doing is using this as your guide. And the reason that we want to do speech outlines to begin with is twofold. The first is for your benefit. A speech outline is really helpful to make sure that you're hitting everything that you need to hit in your speech. And then you can build it out here before you actually go into the steps of writing it out or planning what it is that you want to actually say. This will make sure you have all the pieces in place. But the other reason you do it is because oftentimes professors will want you to turn this in as part of the assignment, either before you give the speech or turning it in tandem with the speech. So you want to know how to do these and how to have them formatted properly. So we're going to break down what you can see what it looks like. And obviously, if you go get the document, you'll be able to reference back to it. But we're just going to go through a few of the elements here to explain them in a little bit more detail so you understand what it is that you're providing in those sections. So we'll start with informative, and then we'll look over at persuasive in a minute. But they're very similar. It's just the difference is in their intent. So you'll notice, aside from the information at the top here, that's just for specification purposes, you'll notice the three different colors, the red, the green, and the blue are the three different sections that you're writing for the speech. The first is the introduction. The second is what we call the body, which has multiple sections in it. And then the third section is the conclusion. And then obviously it goes without saying, if you're using any citations throughout the paper, you're going to have a separate works cited section. So for the works cited section, if you do need to know how to format that, we also have documents in that same Google Drive that you can reference for how to do a works cited page. But for today, we're just going to concentrate on these top three sections. So first things first, the introduction, right? Of course, that goes at the beginning because you're introducing the paper. Now, there are three general elements you want to have in an introduction. The first one is the attention getter. And that pretty much does exactly what it sounds like it does, right? This is grabbing someone's attention. You're trying to entice someone who's listening to you to continue listening to you. You have a very short time to catch someone's attention and hold on to it. So this is how you want to grab it, right? And it needs to link to the topic in some way, right? You don't want it to just be a random thing that's interesting, but that doesn't connect to what it is that you're talking about in some way. After the attention getter and the introduction of what it is that you're going to be speaking about, you're also going to want to include the thesis. Now, we all know what a thesis is, but if you need any help on knowing what needs to be included in a thesis, again, we have a worksheet specifically for thesis statements and what belongs in there, but you absolutely want to make sure that you have that in your introduction. That is the building block for the entirety of a speech or a paper, right, is that thesis. The thesis is what says, this is the topic of what I'm talking about and the different details that I'm going to go into with it. And then the second part of, or the building off of the thesis, you would say, is the preview of your main points. Meaning, you see down here where it says first main point, second main point, right? So however many main points you have, this is where you're going to preview it, up here in the preview. And so that's really just preparing them to understand what it is that you're going to be talking about, prepping them for it. Now, you'll notice in yellow, in between each of these sections, it says the transition, right? Transitions are very important because it makes it feel like you're moving smoothly and without interruption from one subject to the next. So you want to have one of those from the introduction, which is the broad points, down to transition into the first of your main points, which is where it comes in the body here, right? Now, the body of the paper is going to be divided up into your points. Each one has a section, and you'll notice they're all basically the same information listed here, right? First main point, and then it says the subpoints that comes along with it. And then when you're done speaking about it, you transition from the previous main point to the next one. So that's the flow that you want to go with. But I'm going to jump over to the persuasive speech outline for just a second because I want to show you it's essentially the same framework, the same setup, right? For the body here, reason 1, and then you see it has example 1, 2, 3. So that's essentially the same format here as the subpoints are the examples. And essentially the idea is what you're doing in these subpoints is you're providing the supporting material, right? And that can come in a few different ways. It might be details that explain more about the first main point. It might be citations or quotes that are supporting the first main point. Or it might be some sort of an example or narrative that helps to explain the point that you're making. But that's what these points are basically, are the subpoints or the examples. They're explaining that main point, right? It's basically just building on what it is that you've already established. First main point, and then we move to the subpoints. And then when you get to the end of that first body paragraph or the first body section, you transition, just like you did from the introduction to the body. And you do that for as many points as you have. Depending on how long the speech is and what your professor has required, that may change how many you have or how many you can fit into an allotted amount of time. But once you get to the end of that final point and you transition, you're transitioning out from the individual detailed sections now to the conclusion. The conclusion being going back out to that bigger universal picture that you were having with the introduction, which is the overall perspective, not the individual points. And in the conclusion, you always want to include the review, right? That's the review of the main points, essentially revisiting in a very concise way, in a very shortened way, what it is that you discussed over the body of it. And then that leads directly from here's what I discussed to here is the closing statement. Here's the overall perspective or point that I was making by saying all of this, right? So this is sort of the summary closing statement that happens here. And that's really what wraps out the paper. Wraps out the speech, and in this case, wraps out the outline as well. Now, if we go back over to the persuasive speech outline, you'll notice it's essentially the same shape, right? Here, attention grabber at the top in the introduction, and then a thesis. Now, the difference between informative and persuasive comes in a couple of little pieces like this qualification. So what I'm going to show you is the definition between inform and persuade, and that's really going to explain the reason why these are just slightly different, okay? So to inform is literally just to give someone facts or information. You're just telling someone something. So when we look at the informative speech outline, we look here where it says thesis and the preview, right? We don't see any point at which you're trying to convince someone of anything. You're just presenting them with information. However, in persuade, that's exactly what you're doing. You're causing someone to do something through reasoning or argument. So instead of just presenting facts or information, you're trying to convince someone to feel a certain way or do a certain thing. Now, you may still be using facts or information when you're, say, using reasoning or argument, but that's not the ultimate goal. It's not just to do that. It's to cause someone to act or believe a way because of that information. So that's where the outline changes a little bit. So after you've presented the thesis in your introduction, then the next thing you want is what they call the qualification. You're going to tell your listeners what your personal experience or connection is with the topic, which makes you qualified to affect their opinions about it. You know, if you've been a vegetarian for 5 years, then you're someone who can speak about what the vegetarian lifestyle is like. Or if you're going to school for a medical degree, then you can say, here's why I am weighing in on something about the human body or about health, right? Because you have a specific perspective or qualification on it. Now, when you look at the body paragraphs, these are all very similar to the way that the informative speech is laid out. Same for the transition sentences. And then really the final thing that's going to change the difference between informative and persuasive in the speech outlines is down here in the conclusion. You're going to do the summary, just like we talked about in the informative speech outline. But the other thing that we want in here that wasn't exactly a part of the informative speech is the memorable ending or audience challenge, right? So you want to have a powerful closing thought, or you want to have some sort of recommended course of action, meaning you want to leave them with something that impacts them to feel a certain way, or the course of action is to act a certain way, right? So if you're doing a persuasive, you want to persuade them. And when you're done persuading them, you want to give them something they can do now that they've been persuaded that you're correct, right? So this is essentially the framework for almost any outline that you're going to create. If your professor has different parameters than what's listed here, the good news is the shape will probably be the same. There may be differences in how much or what kind of information goes in it. So really all you want to do is take the same shape, see what your professor's guidance is, what it is that they want you to provide in the work that you're writing, and then you just plug that into this same shape. But overall, this is what you're going to be working with. So if you have any questions, always follow up with your professor. If there's questions even beyond there that you don't quite understand, you can always set up a time to speak with a tutor in our live tutoring program. Or if you finish the outline and you just want to get somebody to take a look at it, the perspective, you can always send it to Smart Thinking, where you can get notes sent back to you. So any of these ways are always great ways to make sure that the shape of what you have is correct and that you have all of the information that the professor wants included, both in the outlined and in the eventual speech that you'll be creating from it. So thanks for listening. And if you have any questions, you know how to find us.